Red and blue lights splashed across my porch like a warning I never asked for. The moving truck was still running, its back door hanging open, half my life stacked in cardboard towers on the driveway. In the center of the road stood the HOA head, phone pressed to her ear, shouting that a trespasser was refusing to leave private property. My private property. Neighbors lined the sidewalks like it was a show, whispering, pointing, watching my boxes as if they expected them to vanish. She kept waving printed violation notices in the air, declaring rules I had never agreed to, claiming authority over land she did not own. My chest was tight, not with fear, but with disbelief sharpened into anger. I tried to speak, but every sentence she cut off with louder accusations. Then the patrol car doors opened. An officer stepped forward, calm, professional, and looked straight at me. "Sir, do you have proof you live here?" My hand slid into the folder I had prepared for weeks, and the entire street went silent. If you want to hear more true stories like this, make sure you hit that subscribe button to Fence Line File Stories. And tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? A few months earlier, none of it felt dramatic. It felt like luck. I had been scrolling through county auction listings late one night when a strange entry caught my eye. Not a single house, not a duplex, but an entire unfinished development bundled together like someone had swept a board game into one box and slapped a clearance sticker on it. The photo showed a neat cul-de-sac of nearly identical homes, all painted in soft, neutral colors, all with trimmed hedges and spotless sidewalks. It looked peaceful, almost staged, like a brochure that had never been printed. What made it unusual was the legal description. Most buyers would have skimmed past it. I didn't. The developer had gone bankrupt years earlier, and somewhere in the paperwork chaos, certain pieces of the neighborhood had never been properly transferred. The listing included several undeveloped lots, fragments of utility infrastructure, and something that made me sit upright in my chair, the private road itself. I remember zooming in on the scanned documents, tracing parcel lines like I was solving a puzzle no one else wanted to touch. It didn't make sense at first. Why would a road be for sale? Why would shared spaces still be tied to a failed company instead of a homeowners association? The more I looked, the clearer it became. No one had completed the handoff. The illusion of ownership had replaced the reality of it. For weeks, my evenings turned into research marathons, county records, title histories, old meeting minutes buried in public archives. I read until my eyes burned and my coffee went cold beside me. The deeper I dug, the more it felt like uncovering a forgotten map. Most buyers want simplicity. I've always been drawn to complications. Complications hide opportunities. The paperwork showed that whoever bought the bundle wouldn't just own a house. They would own the bones of the neighborhood itself. The streets people walked on, the small patch of grass labeled community green, even portions of the water and lighting easements. It wasn't flashy wealth. It was quiet leverage. When I finally visited the neighborhood in person, it looked exactly like the photographs, and yet different in a way I couldn't explain. Lawns were perfectly edged, mailboxes aligned like soldiers, flower beds symmetrical to the inch. But there was a stiffness in the air, a rehearsed politeness in the nods neighbors gave each other. Smiles appeared quickly and disappeared just as fast. Conversations ended when I walked by. It was peaceful, yes, but it wasn't relaxed. It felt managed. The Homeowners Association board greeted me warmly at first. Too warmly. The treasurer, a thin woman with clipped sentences and a stack of neatly stapled papers, shook my hand as if it were a formal agreement. Her posture never softened, her smile never quite reached her eyes. Then there was the board head, confident, articulate, welcoming in a way that sounded practiced. She handed me a thick binder of community rules with both hands, like a ceremonial gift. She spoke about harmony, standards, and unity, repeating the word authority, often enough that it echoed long after the conversation ended. At the time, I interpreted it as pride. Looking back, it was something closer to ownership without ownership. Despite the odd undertones, I felt optimistic. I believed I had found a rare opportunity, a clean neighborhood, stable property values, and a legal structure that most people had misunderstood. I imagined quiet mornings, steady renovations, and long-term gains. For a brief stretch of days, everything felt aligned. I even remember standing at the edge of the cul-de-sac one evening, watching the sunset reflect off identical rooftops, thinking how strange it was that something so orderly could have such tangled paperwork beneath it. Then the small details started to surface. A neighbor whispered that paint colors had to be approved. Another mentioned fines for leaving trash bins visible for more than a few hours. A third joked, but not really, that the association noticed everything. Letters began appearing in mailboxes with polite but rigid language about compliance. The word guideline showed up often, but the tone felt closer to command. None of it was directed at me yet, but it was enough to stir a faint unease. It was like hearing distant thunder on a clear day. The illusion finally cracked the morning I received my first official notice. It arrived in a crisp envelope with embossed lettering, addressed to me as if I were already part of a system I had never agreed to join. The message was simple. Approval was required before occupying the property. Approval. To move into land I legally owned. I read the sentence 3 times, expecting it to change. It didn't. That was the moment optimism shifted into something sharper. Not anger yet, not fear, but the quiet realization that someone here believed authority could override facts. And that belief was about to become a problem. The first real collision didn't come with sirens or shouting. It came with a paint roller. I had started small on purpose. A fresh coat on the porch railing, replacing a warped mailbox post, trimming hedges that had grown uneven. Nothing structural, nothing dramatic. Just the kind of light renovation anyone would do before settling in. The morning air smelled like new paint and cut grass, and for a few hours it almost felt normal. I remember thinking that maybe the earlier letter had been a misunderstanding, a bureaucratic hiccup that would smooth itself out once people saw I wasn't tearing the place apart. Then her shadow fell across the driveway. She didn't greet me. She didn't even pretend. She walked straight up holding a clipboard thick with printed pages and began flipping through them like a judge preparing a sentence. Her expression carried absolute certainty, the kind that doesn't ask questions because it assumes it already knows the answers. Without introduction, she held out the first page, a fine for unapproved exterior modification. The second page, a warning for non-compliant landscaping. The third page, a notice about mailbox uniformity violations. Each sheet had bold headings and red underlines, designed less to inform and more to intimidate. I tried to keep the conversation calm. I explained that the railing had been peeling before I bought the property. I pointed out that the mailbox post had been broken. I even thanked her for bringing the paperwork, thinking politeness might soften the exchange. It didn't. She spoke over me, her tone smooth but dismissive, like I was a child interrupting an adult conversation. She emphasized rules, standards, expectations. She said the word community, as if it were a weapon instead of a shared space. A man from 2 houses down slowed his walk and lingered near the sidewalk. He gave me a sympathetic look, the kind strangers exchange when they recognize someone else stepping into trouble. Later, he would quietly tell me to just play along for now. But in that moment, he stayed silent, hands in his pockets, watching. On the opposite side of the street, another neighbor folded her arms and nodded along with every word the HOA head spoke, her agreement loud even without speech. It became clear this wasn't just a conversation. It was a performance. I went inside and returned with my folder. Deeds, survey maps, purchase confirmations. I laid them out on the hood of my car like evidence in a courtroom. I explained, slowly and carefully, that I owned not just the house but the parcels tied to the roadway and shared areas. I expected at least a pause, a flicker of reconsideration. Instead, she smiled, a thin, polite smile that never reached her eyes, and said paperwork could be misinterpreted. Then she tapped the stack of violation notices as if they outweighed everything I had shown her. That afternoon, another letter appeared in my mailbox. Then another the next morning. Then 2 more the day after that. Each one cited a different infraction, paint shade variance, temporary equipment visibility, unauthorized work hours. The speed was deliberate. It felt less like regulation and more like pressure applied in measured doses. My disbelief slowly hardened into something steadier. Not explosive anger. Not panic. Just a controlled awareness that this wasn't going to resolve itself politely. The whispers started too. Conversations paused when I walked past. Curtains shifted. The friendly neighbor eventually stopped me near the curb and muttered that the board doesn't like surprises. He wasn't threatening me, he was warning me. Across the street, the woman who had nodded earlier now stared openly whenever I stepped outside, as if she were waiting for me to make a mistake she could report. By the end of the week, the letters were no longer just warnings. They were demands, fees attached, deadlines printed in bold, language that sounded less like guidance and more like accusation. Every envelope felt heavier than the last, even though they all weighed the same in my hand. I kept adding them to the folder, the stack growing thick enough to bend the edges. Then the message came that changed the temperature entirely. It wasn't a letter slipped quietly into a mailbox. It was an email sent late at night, marked urgent, copied to multiple addresses I didn't recognize. The subject line read, "Emergency Community Meeting." The body of the message stated that my presence and unauthorized modifications would be formally addressed before the board and residents. The phrasing wasn't accidental. It was designed to frame the narrative before I ever entered the room. I stared at the screen for a long time after reading it. The neighborhood outside my window was still, porch lights glowing softly, sprinklers ticking in distant yards. On the surface, everything looked peaceful. But underneath that quiet order, lines had been drawn. This wasn't about paint or hedges anymore. It was organized opposition, scheduled and announced. And for the first time, I realized I wasn't just dealing with paperwork. I was about to walk into a room where people had already decided who I was before I ever spoke. The days after the emergency meeting announcement didn't explode all at once. They tightened, slowly, like a rope being pulled 1 inch at a time. At first, it was small things. Handwritten warning signs taped to shared fences overnight, printed in bold capital letters about unauthorized alterations and pending violations. They weren't addressed to anyone specifically, but they didn't need to be. Everyone knew who they were for. Neighbors who once offered polite nods now avoided eye contact entirely, as if acknowledging me might put them on a list. Then the confrontation started. Never dramatic, never loud enough to be called a scene, just calculated interruptions. Someone would approach while I was unloading materials and casually ask if I had approval paperwork. Another would stop me near the mailbox to remind me that this community has standards. The HOA head appeared more often than anyone else, always with a folder tucked under her arm, always with the same rehearsed calm that somehow felt more aggressive than shouting. She began questioning my legality openly, not just to me but to whoever was nearby. I'd hear my name drift across lawns in half sentences, paired with words like investigation, compliance, review. I tried going the formal route. I called the non-emergency police line to ask about repeated trespassing on the property lines and the posting of unauthorized notices. The response was polite but dismissive. Civil matter. Mediation recommended. Document everything. The words sounded reasonable, but they landed like a door closing softly in my face. When I visited the municipal office to ask about the legality of the signs, I received the same tone, sympathetic but detached. Everyone advised patience. No one offered action. Sleep started slipping away in thin fragments. I would wake at 3 in the morning convinced I'd heard footsteps near the driveway, only to find empty pavement glowing under a streetlight. Cameras went up next. Small, discreet, angled toward the road and the mailbox. Installing them felt both empowering and unsettling, like admitting the problem was real enough to record. Contractors began asking cautious questions before accepting work. One told me quietly that he'd received a call warning him that legal disputes were attached to the address. Another backed out entirely, claiming scheduling conflicts that sounded rehearsed. The moment it turned personal came during a routine delivery. A close friend had stopped by to help unload materials. Nothing dramatic, just an extra pair of hands and a truck bed full of supplies. The HOA head approached with 2 board supporters trailing behind her like witnesses. She didn't address me first. She addressed him. Her tone was sharp, implying he was aiding unauthorized construction, suggesting he could be reported for participation in violations. It wasn't just confrontation, it was intimidation by proxy. My friend stood his ground, but the exchange left a sour taste that lingered long after the truck drove away. It was the first time someone close to me had been pulled into the crossfire, and it shifted something inside me from irritation to vigilance. Rumors began circulating with surprising speed. I heard them secondhand at first, whispers that I planned to tear down homes, that I intended to convert the street into rental units, that bulldozers were already scheduled. None of it was true, but truth moved slower than speculation. The HOA had never said these things directly in front of me, but she didn't need to. The narrative was spreading without fingerprints. I noticed more curtains shifting when I walked outside, more phones raised briefly as if documenting my presence. Despite the pressure, I kept watching. Patterns emerged. The timing of letters, the repetition of phrases, the same three neighbors appearing at every interaction. It wasn't chaos, it was choreography. Recognizing that didn't make it easier, but it made it clearer. I began saving every envelope, every email, every timestamp. The folder thickened until it barely closed. My frustration steadied into something colder, not surrender, not panic, just the quiet understanding that this wasn't about rules anymore. It was about control. The final blow of that phase arrived in a sealed envelope slid under my door just after dusk. The language was formal, heavier than the previous notices, filled with legal phrasing and deadlines printed in bold. It stated that continued non-compliance would result in eviction proceedings and potential legal action. Eviction. The word looked surreal on the page, like it had been copied from someone else's story and pasted into mine by mistake. I stood there reading it again and again while the neighborhood outside remained perfectly still, porch lights glowing, sprinklers ticking, everything outwardly peaceful. Inside, the message echoed with a different reality. A line had been crossed, and the next move would not be subtle. The envelope threatening eviction sat on my kitchen table for an entire night before I touched it again, not because I was afraid of it, but because I needed to read it with a different mindset than the one I'd had when I first opened it. Up until that point, I had been responding, answering letters, showing documents, explaining myself over and over, as if clarity alone would fix the situation. That night, I realized something simple and uncomfortable. I had been arguing from the position of someone asking for permission instead of someone holding proof. The shift didn't come with anger. It came with curiosity. I pulled every document I had collected onto the table. Deeds, parcel maps, purchase agreements, title insurance reports, utility easement diagrams. What had once been a scattered stack of papers slowly became a structured timeline. I highlighted transfer dates, circled parcel identifiers, and cross-checked them with county website archives. The more I organized, the more the picture sharpened. The private roadway wasn't just loosely tied to my purchase, it was explicitly included. The maintenance easements weren't symbolic, they were legally binding. Even the small patches of land labeled as common area had never been transferred to the association. They had simply been assumed into its control through repetition. I made a call the next morning to an old friend who had spent years working in property law. I didn't dramatize the situation. I just asked him to look at the documents with fresh eyes. He arrived with a quiet confidence that contrasted sharply with the chaos of the previous weeks. We sat at the same table where the eviction notice still lay, and he read everything slowly, occasionally nodding, occasionally raising an eyebrow. When he finally leaned back, he didn't smile or laugh. He just said, "They're operating on assumption. You're operating on ownership. Those aren't the same thing." The sentence felt like a key sliding into a lock. That was the moment the fog lifted. I stopped thinking about how to respond and started thinking about how to demonstrate. I reorganized the folder into sections: roadway deed, utility rights, shared parcels, correspondence logs. I created a digital backup with timestamps and labeled screenshots. Security footage from the cameras was clipped and stored, not because I intended to use it immediately, but because it was part of the larger picture. What had once been defensive documentation became strategic evidence. I wasn't preparing excuses anymore. I was preparing clarity. Emotionally, something shifted as well. The constant tension in my chest eased, replaced by a steady focus. The rumors, the letters, the confrontations, they no longer felt like personal attacks. They felt like noise. Not harmless noise, but predictable noise. And predictable problems can be mapped. I began noticing how every escalation from the HOA followed the same pattern: public accusation first, paperwork second, community pressure third. Once you see the pattern, it loses its power to surprise you. I spent evenings building timelines instead of rehearsing arguments. Dates of letters received. Dates of contractor cancellations. Dates of posted signs appearing overnight. The story they had been trying to write about me started to look very different when arranged chronologically. It wasn't chaos, it was a sequence. And sequences can be interrupted. For the first time since moving in, I felt less like a target and more like a participant with agency. I walked the length of the street one afternoon, not to inspect anything, but simply to observe. The same manicured lawns were there, the same identical rooftops, but they no longer looked imposing. They looked like assets tied together by lines on a map I understood better than anyone else here. Authority, I realized, wasn't loud. It was quiet, documented, and patient. I began preparing for something bigger than a reply letter. Not a fight in the emotional sense, but a confrontation in the factual one. I drafted a summary of ownership boundaries. I printed certified copies of deeds. I bookmarked municipal statutes about private road control. Every piece was arranged not to overwhelm, but to illuminate. The goal wasn't to shout louder than the HOA head. The goal was to speak once, clearly, with enough weight behind the words that shouting would become irrelevant. By the end of that week, the eviction notice was no longer the centerpiece of my kitchen table. It was just another page in a thicker stack, one that told a different story when viewed as a whole. I wasn't reacting anymore. I wasn't waiting for the next letter or the next confrontation. I was planning where and how the truth would be presented so that it couldn't be brushed aside with a dismissive smile or a louder voice. The neighborhood remained outwardly calm, sprinklers ticking, porch lights glowing, neighbors walking dogs at dusk. But beneath that still surface, I was no longer drifting. I was aligning pieces. Quietly, deliberately. Preparing for the moment when documentation would step into the center of the room and the narrative would no longer belong to whoever spoke the loudest, but to whoever held the facts. Once the decision was made to stop reacting and start preparing, everything I did became quieter but more deliberate. I stopped explaining myself in casual conversations. I stopped replying immediately to emails that were clearly designed to provoke. Instead, I started building a record so complete that it could speak on its own. Cameras were adjusted, not just installed. Angles refined, motion alerts calibrated, timestamps synchronized. I wanted clarity, not paranoia. I wanted footage that didn't just show events but context. The first small victory came sooner than I expected. One evening, a notification buzzed on my phone while I was reviewing paperwork. A motion alert near the side fence. The video showed a familiar figure stepping onto the edge of the property line, scanning the exterior like an inspector without authority. No damage, no confrontation, just presence where presence wasn't permitted. I saved the clip, labeled it, and filed it away. It wasn't explosive evidence, but it was a pattern beginning to take shape. Patterns, I had learned, were more powerful than single moments. The second breakthrough was quieter but heavier. While organizing HOA correspondence and publicly available reports, I noticed discrepancies in their maintenance claims. The numbers didn't align. Expenses listed in community notices didn't match the visible work being done around the neighborhood. It wasn't dramatic fraud or hidden accounts, but it was enough to raise questions. I documented everything without jumping to conclusions. I wasn't trying to accuse. I was preparing to illuminate inconsistencies if they ever became relevant. Support arrived in subtle ways. A message slipped into my mailbox without a return address, thanking me for standing firm. A neighbor who had previously avoided eye contact stopped me one afternoon and admitted that the board had a habit of exaggerating authority. These gestures were small, almost whispered, but they shifted the emotional balance. I wasn't alone. I was simply the one standing in the open while others watched from the edges. Their hesitation wasn't opposition. It was caution. Meanwhile, the antagonist grew louder. Community emails began using urgent language, framing upcoming discussions as critical for neighborhood protection. Flyers appeared on bulletin boards announcing a special vote regarding enforcement measures. The tone suggested finality, as if a single meeting could erase documented ownership. It was theatrical, but effective. People respond to certainty even when it isn't grounded in fact. Watching it unfold felt like observing the other side of a chessboard. Bold moves meant to intimidate rather than outmaneuver. I kept my routine steady. Contractors resumed work once I showed them the organized documents. Professionals I consulted offered practical advice: keep communication written, avoid emotional exchanges, maintain timelines. Each conversation reinforced the same principle: clarity beats confrontation. The more structured my approach became, the less reactive I felt. The anxiety that once kept me awake at night turned into alertness, a different kind of energy that sharpened focus instead of scattering it. There were moments of doubt, of course. Late evenings when the house fell quiet and the streetlights cast long shadows across identical rooftops, I would wonder if one misstep could undo everything. A missed email, a poorly phrased response, a single emotional outburst caught on camera. Any of it could shift perception. That awareness kept me disciplined. I reviewed footage weekly, archived correspondence daily, and updated timelines as if preparing for an audit no one had announced yet. The neighborhood itself became a study in contrasts. Children still rode bicycles in slow circles. Lawns were still trimmed to uniform heights. Yet beneath that routine calm, two narratives were forming, one loud and public, the other quiet and documented. The antagonist pushed for visibility, for declarations and collective pressure. I focused on precision, on records that didn't change depending on who was speaking. It wasn't aggression, it was alignment. Eventually, the date was announced. A formal community meeting, framed as a decisive vote on enforcement and compliance. The wording suggested resolution, but I recognized it as a stage. The moment both sides had been circling without saying it out loud. I printed certified copies of key documents, updated digital backups, and confirmed that every camera was functioning. I didn't rehearse speeches. I rehearsed calm. In the days leading up to the meeting, the tension in the neighborhood became almost visible. Conversations paused mid-sentence when I walked by. Flyers were adjusted on notice boards as if clarity in typography could substitute for clarity in legality. On my side, everything was already in place. Evidence organized, timelines complete, support quietly acknowledged. It felt less like preparing for a fight and more like preparing to turn on a light in a room where people had grown used to the dark. When the final reminder email arrived with the meeting time and location, I read it once and closed my laptop. Both sides now had a date, a place, and an audience. The difference was that one side was bringing volume and the other was bringing facts. The street outside looked as calm as it had on the day I first visited. Identical homes, quiet sidewalks, trimmed hedges. But beneath that stillness, the pieces had been arranged. The next move wouldn't be loud. It would be definitive. The community center parking lot was already half full when I arrived. Headlights cutting across trimmed hedges and identical mailboxes that looked like they had been measured with rulers. I sat in my car for a moment longer than necessary, not out of hesitation, but to steady the rhythm of my breathing. The folder rested on the passenger seat, thicker now than it had ever been, its edges worn from weeks of organizing and reorganizing. Outside, silhouettes moved toward the entrance in small clusters, conversations hushed but urgent. No one laughed. Even the air felt charged, like the seconds before a summer storm breaks. Inside, folding chairs had been arranged in neat rows facing a long table where the board usually sat. Tonight that table looked less like furniture and more like a stage. Phones were already out, some openly recording, others held casually at chest level with camera lenses peeking over knuckles. The room smelled faintly of coffee and dry erase markers. I took a seat near the aisle, close enough to see every expression but far enough not to appear confrontational. The folder stayed on my lap, closed, my hands resting lightly on top of it as if it were nothing more than paperwork for a routine meeting. The antagonist entered with a confidence that bordered on theatrical. She moved through the room greeting supporters, nodding firmly, placing a reassuring hand on shoulders as if she were rallying a team before a championship game. A few neighbors straightened in their seats when she passed, others avoided eye contact entirely. I noticed the same 3 individuals who had appeared at nearly every prior interaction take seats near the front, forming a quiet line of visible allegiance. The whispers grew louder, then softened again when the board table filled. When the meeting opened, the tone was polite for exactly 1 minute. Formalities were read. Agenda items listed. Then the shift came. Subtle, deliberate, as the focus turned to community compliance. My name wasn't said immediately, but the direction was obvious. Words like disruption, unauthorized actions, and neighborhood standards floated across the room, each one landing heavier than the last. Heads nodded in rhythm, not necessarily in agreement, but in familiarity. Repetition has a way of sounding like truth when spoken often enough. I waited. When the accusations finally became direct, they arrived in rapid succession. Questions about legality. Suggestions that ownership claims were misunderstood. References to complaints and violations stacked like dominoes meant to fall together. I answered calmly when addressed, keeping sentences short, tone even. The goal wasn't to win a debate, it was to maintain clarity. Every time the volume in the room rose, I lowered mine slightly. Every time a finger pointed, I folded my hands. The contrast did more work than any argument could have. Phones lifted higher. Someone began live streaming. The atmosphere tightened, the collective attention narrowing until the room felt smaller than it was. I could sense fear at the edges of my own focus, not fear of losing, but fear of the unpredictable. Public gatherings have momentum, and momentum can turn quickly. Determination sat beside that fear like a steady companion, reminding me that preparation had a purpose. The folder remained closed. Not yet. The antagonist leaned into the performance. She referenced letters, cited rules, and spoke about preserving the character of the neighborhood. Supporters murmured approval at practiced intervals. A few neighbors looked conflicted, their gazes shifting between the board table and the documents resting on my lap. The tension wasn't just between 2 people, it was between narratives, one loud and certain, the other quiet and waiting. Minutes stretched. Words circled. The room warmed under the weight of collective attention. I could feel the moment approaching the way you feel the crest of a wave before it breaks, the subtle lift, the inevitable forward motion. The antagonist's tone sharpened, sentences shortening, certainty hardening into finality. She called for resolution, for decisive action, for the community to protect itself. The language was designed to end the discussion, to move from debate to decree. Then it happened. She called for immediate removal. The phrase cut through the room like a dropped glass. Chairs shifted. Phones steadied. For a fraction of a second, everything held still, not silent, but suspended. That was the moment I had been preparing for, the precise intersection of confidence and overreach. I felt the fear flicker once more, then settle. My hands lifted from the folder. The clasp opened with a soft click that somehow sounded louder than the earlier shouting. I stood. The folder was heavier than it looked, thick with weeks of organization, timelines, certified copies, and recorded patterns. I didn't raise it high. I didn't rush. I simply stepped forward into the aisle, meeting the room's attention without resistance. A calm smile formed almost on its own, not triumphant, not mocking, just certain. The performance on the other side had reached its peak. The room leaned in, waiting for the next line in a script they thought they already knew. And for the first time that night, the narrative was no longer being spoken. It was about to be shown. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. The room was already leaning forward, already holding its breath, and the only sound that cut through the silence was the soft shuffle of paper as I opened the folder on the long board table. Certified copies slid into place one by one, deeds stamped with county seals, parcel maps marked in clean black lines, transfer confirmations dated months before the first violation letter had ever been printed. I wasn't performing. I was arranging facts in a way that couldn't be brushed aside. The antagonist stepped closer, her confidence still intact for the first few seconds, the way someone continues walking before realizing the ground has changed beneath their feet. She reached for one of the documents as if touching it might make it less real. It didn't. The seal caught the overhead light, the embossed mark unmistakable even from across the table. Murmurs began to ripple through the chairs behind me, Quiet at first, then layered, then unmistakable. People weren't reacting to me. They were reacting to the paper. I explained nothing dramatic. I simply pointed. Roadway deed. Utility easement. Shared parcel ownership. Each page answered a question before it could be asked. The room's energy shifted in slow increments, like a tide reversing direction. The same neighbors who had once folded their arms now leaned sideways to see more clearly. Phones adjusted angles. A few supporters near the front exchanged glances that no longer carried certainty, only calculation. Then the police arrived. No sirens this time, just the quiet opening of the doors at the back of the hall. 2 officers stepped in with the calm professionalism of people used to tension but not impressed by it. The antagonist's shoulders straightened instantly, her voice rising as if authority had just walked in to validate her claims. She began speaking quickly, layering accusations and references to rules, but the officer nearest the table raised a hand, not aggressively, just enough to pause the flow. He asked for documentation. I slid the top set of papers forward. The officer read them carefully, lips moving slightly as he followed the parcel descriptions. His partner leaned in, scanning the seals, the signatures, the dates. It took less than a minute, but in that minute the room changed more than it had in weeks. The officer nodded once, then twice, and spoke in a tone that carried across every chair. The documents were valid. The ownership was clear. The roadway and specified parcels belonged to me. Civil matter resolved by record. The antagonist tried one last surge. She argued about bylaws, about community standards, about operational authority. Her voice climbed, words stacking too quickly to hold their shape. But the officer's response didn't match her volume. It matched the paper. Authority, he explained calmly, follows ownership. Rules can exist, but they cannot override deeds. The sentence didn't echo. It landed. Support shifted almost visibly. The treasurer, who had once spoken in clipped formalities, lowered her gaze and began flipping through her own notes as if hoping they might rearrange themselves. A supporter near the aisle slowly uncrossed her arms. Someone in the back let out a quiet breath that sounded like relief. It wasn't applause. It was release, the kind that comes when confusion finally meets clarity. The antagonist's final attempt wasn't loud. It was desperate. She accused the process, the timing, the fairness of the meeting itself. But the energy that had once carried her words forward was gone. Facts have a gravity to them. Once they settle, they're hard to lift again. The officers remained neutral, the documents remained visible, and the narrative she had built over weeks dissolved in the space of a few verified pages. By the time the board table cleared, the structure that had felt immovable was suddenly fragile. The authority that had once been projected through tone and repetition had nothing left to anchor it. I didn't celebrate. I didn't smile wider or raise the folder like a trophy. I simply gathered the papers back into place the same way I had arranged them, methodical, quiet, complete. Around me, conversations began in low voices, neighbors turning toward one another instead of toward the front. The tension that had filled the hall thinned into something lighter, almost uncertain. The conflict itself was over. The truth had been spoken in the only language that couldn't be interrupted. Yet the aftermath was already forming in the background. Questions about leadership, about process, about how a community so orderly on the surface had drifted so far from its foundation. As I stepped away from the table, the antagonist stood still for a moment longer, the weight of public certainty replaced by the absence of it. The power structure that had once towered over every conversation had crumbled without a single raised voice. The victory wasn't explosive. It was precise. And as the room slowly returned to ordinary sound, chairs sliding, phones lowering, people exhaling, it was clear that while the confrontation had ended, the neighborhood itself was only beginning to understand what came next. The days after the meeting were quieter than I expected. Not silent, not awkward, just different. The loud certainty that had once filled every corner of the neighborhood seemed to dissolve overnight, replaced by a cautious calm. The antagonist did not make another public appearance as head of the board. Her name slowly disappeared from emails, then from printed notices, and eventually from conversations altogether. It wasn't dramatic. It was gradual, like a sign being taken down piece by piece until only the empty hooks remained. The association itself shifted in tone almost immediately. Meetings became shorter, agendas clearer, language simpler. The treasurer stepped into a temporary leadership role, speaking carefully but honestly, acknowledging that assumptions had been mistaken and processes would change. Transparency replaced volume. Financial summaries were shared openly, and for the first time, discussions sounded like conversations instead of declarations. The structure didn't collapse. It corrected itself. Neighbors who had once avoided eye contact began offering small gestures of reconciliation. A wave from across the street. A quiet apology near the mailbox. One evening, a couple stopped me during a walk just to say they were relieved the situation had been resolved without things getting ugly. None of them used the word sorry directly, but the meaning was there in the way they lingered instead of hurrying past. The tension that had once lived between driveways thinned into something almost neighborly. For me, the change was internal as much as external. The constant alertness that had defined the previous weeks softened. I slept through the night without checking camera notifications. The folder of documents moved from the kitchen table to a shelf, still accessible but no longer central. I realized that the real victory wasn't proving ownership. It was proving that patience, preparation, and clarity could outlast intimidation. Noise had tried to overpower facts, and facts had simply waited. The neighborhood itself began to breathe differently. Lawns were still trimmed, and sidewalks still neat, but now there was ease behind the order. Morning walks included greetings instead of glances. Contractors returned without hesitation. Conversations drifted toward ordinary topics: weather, weekend plans, garden projects. The sameness of the houses no longer felt oppressive. It felt peaceful, like a pattern chosen rather than imposed. Property values ticked upward in quiet reports, not because of sudden change, but because stability had replaced uncertainty. I often thought back to the moment in the meeting hall when the room shifted, when the stack of papers carried more weight than any raised voice ever had. That memory stayed with me, not as a triumph, but as a lesson. Authority built on assumption can sound powerful, but it has no foundation. Authority built on evidence doesn't need to shout. It simply stands. The experience didn't make me distrustful of communities or rules. It made me attentive to the difference between structure and control, between guidance and dominance. Peace returned in ordinary ways. Coffee on the porch without watching the street. Evenings spent planning renovations instead of drafting responses. The cameras remained, but they became background tools rather than symbols of tension. The folder gathered a light layer of dust on its edge, a reminder of a chapter closed through persistence rather than confrontation. I learned that preparation isn't paranoia when it's rooted in reality. It's protection. And documentation, when used calmly, becomes a form of clarity rather than conflict. In the end, the neighborhood didn't just stabilize, it matured. The people who lived there realized that shared spaces require shared truth, not shared fear. The false power structure faded because it had nothing solid beneath it, while the simple weight of records, timelines, and patience reshaped the environment without a single shouted victory speech. Life returned to what it had promised at the beginning: calm mornings, genuine greetings, and the quiet satisfaction of knowing that truth, when given time and order, doesn't just win. It restores balance. If you want to hear more true stories like this, make sure you hit that subscribe button to Fenceline Files Stories. And tell me in the comments, where are you watching from?